In our musical times of today, where we study body of works of composers, full opuses, chronologically organized or thematically, but mostly chronologically, so that when we study a time period of the past, and there are so many for the stylistic facts, we tend to catalog everything into a body of work with of course closed number of works, regardless of the lost ones which we might find occasionally or accidentally at somebody's attic. But generally speaking, it gives us a general view of the output of the composers, even if they died very young and very many centuries ago. But that said, I think that this approach of the complete oeuvre, where we define stylistic evolution according to what we see from our perspective of today, that is a little bit of a controversial fact, because if we really want to think about how the composers whom we study and we learn about and we place in a chronological stylistic evolution, if you want, from a certain time period, let's say at least from Middle Ages or early Renaissance through Baroque into still gallant classic, then of course late classic, early romantic. It's anyway, the thresholds are not very clear because some overlapped by living longer, mostly didn't complete their complete courses of completion because they died very young. So we'll never have the late periods of some composers in terms of their development or their desire to evolve in their musical language. Chopin, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Weber all come easily in mind. And would that have then changed in a way the evolution of the stylistic, sociologically placed in its own time frame, inevitably politically as well, time? We would never know, because sometimes then you would have had influences by later composers into, for instance, younger composers. Imagine Brahms writing the sort of classical music style in the Romanticism. And for us is perhaps not that important, but for the academia it is. To chronologize, to organize into stylistic systems of groups of people, and who was an avant-garde and who was conservative or looking backwards in time for their own time period. And then after that we have the early modernism until atonality, which could be the real fracture in that continuum of stylistic evolution through the tonal systems establishment and capacity to adapt to each different composer's style and time period, while keeping a common language that makes it accessible, if not understandable, judgmentally possible to find it subjectively bad or good. Schumann, Debussy themselves wrote reviews about compositions of others in magazines. So obviously everybody has, even if they don't publish it, their opinion about what is legitimate in their view in terms of a compositional output and in terms of its compositional placement in the chronology of the events in terms of the stylistic advancement. I think it's important to give that universal knowledge, because a student will arrive and would like to know when what starts and gets to become what, and through which musical language evolution. Is it modal, tonal, then atonal, and then perhaps in a way restarting again, re-enchanting or re-enriching a century before, as the neoclassicism, let's say, as one of the movements of the early 20th century was considered, of course, by essence, but that's not musical quality of the works. It's the way we think about the evolution of the stylistic works. We would say that that is inevitably looking backwards. But the avant-garde, by essence, meaning ahead of the others, is that they have a way to have heard music that we haven't yet imagined. They have imagined structures, forms, or tuning systems, or order of hierarchy of notes, or the lack of hierarchy of notes in a series that becomes their signature. And ultimately, what really I think is the main reason for which we have such fracture with the post-tonal music for the last now almost 100 years is because it tends to bring each composer to champion their own musical language with their own not only sentences and syntaxes and agogic, but also their own alphabet, musically speaking, between the tuning and the choice of the order of the notes in series. But subjectively speaking, in order to be able even to have an opinion and say, oh, I don't like it, or I like it, when you should say, I don't understand it, but I will try again. And try to find the lock, some key that you might have to forge in order to enter, to unlock all the intellectual and perhaps also emotional input that these composers of the post-tonal systems left us as a legacy. They wrote it and we don't play and hear it as much as we do presently the music of at least 2 centuries and 3 centuries ago, rather than the last 80 or 100 years. And I think this brings a certain sense of confusion in the concept of what a composer's output is. Is it a first period where inevitably they're influenced by something preceding them, either stylistically, either pedagogically, either subconsciously? It could be also oral tradition, folkloric music, music of the popular tunes, and then made them into the westernized notation from oral transmission to written symphonic, orchestral, of course, soloistic or chamber music or vocal and all that music. But of course, the music without lyrics is more timeless, paradoxically, even if their style evolves, than the one connected to lyrics. Would they be unforgettable poems or librettos for operas or songs specifically only, regardless if it's a poem or some kind of text that inspires to be set in music besides the music of the words themselves, given the language. But the language limits the universality of the access compared to the piano, the instrument, the strings, the winds, the voice when vocalizing, and of course the orchestra at large, and the oratorios, the choir with orchestra. Of course, most of the time you have a choir and singers, you have inevitably lyrics. And it's factual that lyrics are dated because language evolves through the centuries. And music, of course, stays in a given style that we define today as being Baroque, not them in their own time. And we define that there is an influence of this composer over this when they started the early output, if they didn't destroyed because they thought it hasn't yet reached the fruition of their blossomed own personality in terms of musical expression, in musical language, obviously, but mostly like the signature of their personality. Even if it's reminiscent, like in family portraits, you can see whose looks are closer to whose other ancestors' looks. So there is some kind of alchemy that, of course, the composers come up with their own invention, creation, and universally so, regardless that they didn't choose in which time period they appear on Earth. And not that we have the choice, but we have today, more than they ever had in their time, the capacity to study in length, in depth, in details, in niches, their music of their time. And we start discovering composers whose fame didn't make it to the dictionary or to the main courses of classical music review of stylistic proportions that goes from, let's say, Renaissance to modernity, and within which you cover different geographic countries, specific style, the European French versus the European Spanish, German, or English, or Dutch, or Flemish in the earlier days. And then, of course, the Americas and so on. So you have also this Asian input, or areas of Russia, which was in Europe and mostly in Asia, but also Asian countries where they develop at a different time period the classical music, reflective music, intellectual music styles, without to be rooted so much in their own past, which was, as most folk music is, transmission, oral transmission. And so it seems to me clear that the point of view of the composers of the past, whom we study about their own past, was very, very, very fragmented, with full of holes and very little access to scores, recordings, or articles describing them. Or, in other words, there was very little time to live, a lot of creations to make in order to partly survive and partly try to leave a trace, because I think that that was also part of Beethoven's own opinion of himself, which was very high. And somebody like Schubert, who was sort of marginal and marginalized by himself in a way, the system in Vienna, which had only eyes for Beethoven, it can be so close to the sun that you can get burned. And he was so influenced by Beethoven. And it's inevitable, understandable. I don't think it should be considered negative, though idealizing the input of each composer's personal musical language, signature style, recognizable among all within few seconds of hearing a piece of theirs, regardless the genre, if it is opera, strings, piano, voice, or whatever. And perhaps that means that they filled in as a portion, a corner, a section of the tonal system hierarchy that they customized according to the emotional expression or intellectual speculation on the facts of how you organize the tones, that becomes something we attribute to them. Parallel triads in augmented fifths, like for Debussy, is very cliche and not subtle enough, because Debussy didn't just only write that, but when you play augmented fifth chords on different steps, you feel that. And you say, oh, that sounds like Debussy. So inevitably, other composers who write augmented fifths in some kind of parallelism of steps, then we would say, oh, but it's like Debussy, as if it means, oh, that doesn't mean much because it's already been written, so what's the point? And I find that the most structurally important appreciation to have for a composer's musical language in terms of their own stylistic, let's say, unicity, or rambunctious personality, or some kind of way that their expression jumps out through their notes to our knowledge, and we immediately attribute it to this and that for the influences over others. And I find that to be very healthy, as a matter of fact, to be aware of all that. But the way I think that we could say that the parallel 6 doesn't reduce to Brahms, no more, as I said, this reduces to Debussy. Or perhaps the descending modulation by third with minor trads would remind us of Franck. Some plagal cadence with modality was picked up by composers like Fauré way after the Gregorian. We didn't use the third, so there was no major nor minor for the monks to sing in. The psalms. And you have something like 6/4 parallel chords on a given ostinato. That is reminiscent of Ravel. And I think in a time period where the publishers, the recordings, and the competitions tend to unify so that the students can sound alike, passing through obstacles, playing clean, the consensual editions that pretend to bring us the authenticity, even if there are discrepancies between manuscripts when they're available and not lost to time, and earlier editions, and compare and contrast each bar individually, the picking up on a detail while also looking at the phrase, the direction, the grand gesture. I think the phrasing is more important, the structure more important than the notes. And then once you've organized the structure, the construction, ephemeral as it is, you still fill it in with contrasting thematic materials, transitions, modulations, variations on the style of the theme that can be expressed in different modalities, tonalities. You could find common tones between two distant tonalities and create perhaps even an inharmonic modulation. So there are so many devices to express different moods, or that are suggestive of the moods according to our interpretation of it, and probably not theirs, since they don't leave us their interpretation. They leave us the essence of their thoughts through signs written on a paper, and we bring it alive with our point of view, just like our ancestors did bring the same pieces alive with their reality of the time. Sliding on the strings between notes was an expression device that violinists don't use anymore. Substitutions on the piano for constant legato is something you don't see either today anymore. Evolution of quality of pianos, hygrometry maintained in concert halls allows for fingerings without changing on the same note. The substitutions. So that creates then a sense of length of sound, a harmonization, an expectation of pedal that is resonant according to the acoustics. Of course, the recordings shaped a lot the ear of the budding musician who listens to this very resonant recording, and then they practice on the piano in a dry room. Let's say they're pianists, string quartetists too, in a room or whatever. But it is fact that it doesn't sound like when we loved discovering it if we did through a recording. So there is an enhancement of the elements through the electronics of the placement of the microphone. Very often you hear a concerto and you hear some solo parts in the orchestra that are heard equally loud than the tutis of the great strings section in terms of their thematic importance or melodic importance and how they combine with the soloist in the case of a piano concerto. But from the stage or on the at least first rows of the hall, you don't hear these orchestration balances the way you hear it in the recording, where they're enhanced to bring you closer, almost artificially, to by the reality of the volume of sound output between orchestra musicians. So this soundscape, this psychological musical soundscape, our understanding of their language, our misunderstanding, or our assumption that they had to be influenced, therefore lesser value before they find more of their own character in their music, would it be through a gimmick or not, but probably we think it is. So I think that since they didn't study the music of the past, my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, was very keen to say that sometimes the bad music was boring in the past, but still in the tonal system, so it was sort of understandable. Today it's difficult to be able to enter in to unlock the musical language of a contemporary composer, because it is just mind-blowing by the time you're able to enter into it. But then once you're in it, you really are in this enchanted world, and it's hermetically locked to others. Whenever through the tonal system, some kind of universal pass, the key that opens all doors, you still have to adorn it in the stylistic specificities, instrumental evolution, hearing, tuning, projection, sound, resonance, halls compared to salons or mentions, and evolution of length of sound compared to the pedal, which is more harmonizing than melodizing, because if not, you'll blur. And then the capacity of the composers to adapt to the evolution of the instruments. Beethoven producing his keyboard sonatas no more for harpsichord playable on fortepiano, but directly with the advantages and loss of some subtlety of the fortepiano's predecessor, the harpsichord. But we think of it as a predecessor, not people who were then. And I think that in their point of view, the corpus of their work was not probably as clear, obviously, as to us. And so therefore their evolution and what they rejected from the past, or what they adopted from the past, or what they tried to adapt and adopt and alter, rather than ignore or restart or reset, which is not really possible, but some tried. And so it is a fascinating time to be a teacher and a student, because you have access more than ever in history of music to sound, audio, video, pictures, articles. You can hear people play differently, people think differently, people write differently, how they understand all this music. But ultimately, I don't think that the composers whom we play have the awareness in their own time where they were placed in that chronology of events, possibly because of survival necessities and short living expectation. And that's probably part of why also they didn't travel as much. They didn't have so much, if not almost no, contact with an alternative way of thinking music, let's say in other paradigms. I mean, the whole idea of the planet and its musical expression for different necessities, religious, social, just for the pleasure, or organizing like a fugue, some kind of a crossword puzzle of the mind with meaningful polyphonic organization of the voices, is an idealized society of equals. I mean, all these things appear so possible today to be analyzed, understood, misunderstood, restudied. Perhaps you have an article that disagrees from a preceding article. From that point of view, it's not like it cancels the past, but it evolves the understanding, and perhaps the instrumental knowledge and the copies of old instruments and the way we play them and we think of them, the way we hear music, the way we hear silence, the way we think we hear climax in terms of how much and where and how often, and is it a necessity for the expression of the melodic phrase or the harmonic structure, or if none of these for the notes spread in space. I think it's fascinating. To do well anything is so much demanding discipline, organization, really organization of the thoughts, organization of the ways that you bring out the texture, the shadow, the lights, the forte, the piano, the loud, the soft, the short, the long, the groupments of notes, of the phrasings, the evocation of string instruments through the morphing of the piano into one, playing with them. This constant morphing of the elements of music that goes from an orchestration to a piano piece, of a piano piece orchestrated, colorized, black and white, as if that was probably the closest, I would say, comparison with visual arts. While, of course, music is an audio experiment, experience that brings us reflection, self search, Sehnsucht, as Beethoven used to say, the inner world that comes out as a reminiscence of something, or perhaps something anew. And I like that we can think of these composers through the evolution of their works, and how I think of them with a lot of tenderness and a lot of compassion for their own fights through survival, and sometimes more than less disappointments when even a Bach is not getting a job with a B minor mass when he auditioned with. So if that is the case, then when I miss an audition, perhaps that should relatively be less dramatic if I take that in account. But every life matters for itself on the moment it's lived intensely with hopes and desires and convictions, and changing possibly too from time to time the paradigm, but the status quo has to be rethought. And I find that to be a fantastic time where we play the composer's thoughts, the composer's inner worlds, the DNA of the thought processes. Fascinating. Fascinating.